20 years ago today, troops from a Western alliance spearheaded by the US entered Iraq, starting a long conflict, the ramifications of which are still felt today. 18 months after 9/11, the US was fearful that a so-called axis of evil, led by Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein, would engage in greater attacks against the West due to the supposed weapons of mass destruction that Hussein was hiding. On the circumstantial evidence of WMDs, the US, heavily backed by British allies, entered Iraq. Hussein was later deposed and executed, creating a power vacuum in Iraq, leading to insurgencies of terror groups in the region, such as Al-Qaeda, and the creation of the terror group widely known as ISIS, as well as the growing influence of Iran in the Middle East. But with trillions of dollars spent, hundreds of thousands dead, and, as it turned out, no proof of WMDs in Iraq, what was all this for? At the time, based on the intelligence that they had, were the US and Great Britain right to invade Iraq out of fears for their safety? What lessons can be learned from the invasion and the subsequent war in Iraq? Should George W. Bush and Tony Blair be tried for war crimes? And, 20 years on, what is the legacy of the Iraq War?
So let's get to it. What is the legacy of the Iraq War? As always, gentlemen, we begin with our quick fire round, 30 seconds each to lay out your initial stance on the matter, and we pick it up from there. So Christopher Neiweem, please take the lead.
Well, the initial goal in terms of the invasion and deposing Saddam Hussein, the mission was successful. We saw that early on. And the second half of the war, which I would argue was the most important, unfortunately, I think it'll be looked back in history as a failure. And it's painful for me to say that because of so many people, some of which I served with, who lost their life, were critically injured, many of which I've worked with over the last 20 years. So the first phase was successful, and the second phase, post-democratization plan and pushing democracy through Iraq was a failure, unfortunately.
Michael Tracey, your thoughts?
Well, the legacy of Iraq at this point, 20 years later, is to serve as a convenient scapegoat for defenders of the present foreign policy consensus to make it seem as though they can just cast off Iraq as this aberration and everything else that they're agitating for, even though it's just as zealously entangled with concepts of regime change and abrogation of democracy and just hyper-militarism and nation building. That all is fine because we can just point to Iraq as this one instance where it all went a little bit off the rails.
Yeah, we will unpack all the different motivations in a split second. Last but not least, Nathanael Chouraqui, your thoughts?
Well, the first legacy of the war in Iraq is turning Iran into a regional hegemon by destabilizing the triad that was in place in the Middle East, with Iran, Iraq, and Turkey being the three main powers. Now it's mostly Iran, Turkey, and a little bit Saudi Arabia. The second thing is a trauma for Western foreign policy and a sheer and shared delusion of interventionism and involvement in Middle Eastern affairs.
Okay, gentlemen, on that note, let's please feel free to interact from this point onwards. And I would like to begin with a question that might sound misleading or flat, but in my opinion, at least, it is multi-layered to an extent. Is the Iraq War over, Christopher?
Well, I think the Iraq War is over. You know, I think going back to after the First World War and the Second World War, there have been these major themes, these treaties. The problem in the Middle East goes back to the Sykes-Picot Treaty, which was made between England and France in private, essentially disbanding previously made agreements, and I believe it caused distrust in the Arab world for generations, and that was never resolved. So these power vacuums, these factions after the Iraq War were violent, they were irritated, they were aroused to a certain extent, and without the sufficient first troop numbers on the way in, and there was just no way to quell that. So I would say the war is over now. We're in we're looking back 20 years, but After the Sykes-Picot Agreement, there were distrust, and there was understandably in the Arab world. And unfortunately, I just don't think that the West was able to overcome that, despite the blood, sweat, and treasure that many service members, myself included, who fought in Iraq, despite those sacrifices. That's where we find ourselves today.
Yeah, Nathaniel, what do you think?
I think even if the Iraq war is over, it shouldn't be considered as over, because the Iraq crisis very much continues. And I'm talking about the political crisis and the humanitarian crisis. As very often we see a lot of means being deployed by Western powers when it comes to successfully, in that case, depose a tyrant or fight back Islamic State. We'll get back to that. But when it comes to reconstruction, the efforts are simply not there. And what we see is Iraq still very much being a humanitarian crisis, with millions of people needing humanitarian help, hundreds of thousands of people that are still displaced, major infrastructure and educational damage, and very much a zone that, if you don't want to hear the humanitarian argument, that is still very much prone to destabilization, whether it is from Iran or from endogenous armed group that at any moment can resurface and create further problems. So it can still be a breeding ground for further suffering for the Iraqis and maybe for the rest of the world as well.
So, Michael, let's circle back to your opening remarks. The weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, exploiting democracy. 2 decades on, do we know why the U.S. Go to war? Does it matter?
It does matter, but with these lurches into war, it's often difficult to pinpoint a single moment when the wheels really started spinning and a final determination was made. I think more significant maybe is to note that the Iraq war hasn't ended from the standpoint of the ideological hubris which underpinned the Iraq war continues in full force to this very day, as do some of the very personnel who were integral in bringing about the Iraq war remain in power. I'll just give you one example of that few are aware of. Victoria Nuland, who is this senior State Department official in the Biden administration, is basically overseeing to a large extent Ukraine policy, or at least she has a major hand in sort of setting the terms of the Biden administration's policy in Ukraine and relative to Russia. She was one of the chief foreign policy advisors to Dick Cheney in the first Bush administration, and was dispatched by Paul Wolfowitz, one of the central neoconservative theoreticians, to go to Brussels and lobby NATO to support the initial U.S. incursion into Iraq. So not only is she still around, not only hasn't she been, ostracized from public life, she's currently wields a massive amount of power as it relates to the foremost foreign policy issue facing the country today. So if someone like Victoria Nuland is able to remain in good standing and also accrue additional leverage over the gears of American foreign policy making, then I would say that in that very real sense, the Iraq war has not ended by any stretch.
Well, before we get back to Christopher, Michael, just because you've mentioned it, if the U.S.-Iraq war casus belli, the reason they had to war was fear for national safety, national security, how is that different from the Russian one in Ukraine? And excuse me if it may sound provocative.
Well, I mean, Russia routinely cites the precedent of the Iraq war as a straightforward flouting of international law and as flying in the face of all these strictures, which today the U.S. tries to portray Russia as the singular violator of, which clearly it's not. And then if you bring up Iraq because you're not like 12 years old, or you have some fleeting memory of the arguments that went into launching that invasion and how it was pointed out at the time that international law would be irrevocably tarnished as a result of it, then you're accused of indulging in whataboutism or even peddling Russian propaganda, which is very convenient.
And the two test cases are indeed fascinating also from the media landscape, the Iraq war to an extent, the Well, we'll move on from that. Christopher, back to you so we don't divert from topic. Could the U.S. have won the war in hindsight?
I think it would have been dependent on the partners in the country, the Coalition Provisional Authority, the trying to set up the constitutional framework was unsuccessful. But one thing that I thought was quizzical is when Mr. Tracey mentioned some obscure figure in the State Department, the President of the United States, as well as a previous Democrat nominee for president, Hillary Clinton, were voted for the Iraq War. So, I mean, this idea that there's some obscure State Department person out there somewhere that had some sort of hand in building that foreign policy. Many of the advisors in the Vietnam War, previous wars, have stuck around to do things, but the President of the United States today voted for the Iraq War and supported the invasion. So that point really didn't make much sense to me. I mean, I do think that looking at all of these questions and all their implications are important, but it's very convenient for people to have one particular view and then never answer the terror question, or be a total war hawk and not answer how we're going to treat veterans and the $5 trillion deficit and the thousands of troops that were killed. And so I feel like we kind of get into this chess game of just giving our opinions based on a narrow scope without looking at the bigger picture. The President of the United States voted for the Iraq War, so I don't know why we're talking about some obscure person in the State Department.
Well, first of all, Victoria Nuland is not obscure. She is playing a very outsized role in running the Ukraine policy portfolio in the State Department. And even according to a report a few days ago in Foreign Policy magazine, she is the one who's giving her recommendation for who the White House National Security Council ought to staff its ranks with in terms of personnel. But of course, Joe Biden is not at all sort of beyond scrutiny on this. I was just giving Nuland as one particular example. In fact, if you want to talk about Joe Biden, not only did he vote for the war, right? I mean, that's well known, as is the case that Hillary Clinton voted for it and John Kerry and et cetera, et cetera. Joe Biden today continues to invoke sort of pablum and platitudes that are very much reminiscent of the Iraq War in order to justify his current policy in Ukraine. When he went to Kyiv last month, he was rattling off these grandiose proclamations about how freedom as we know it is at stake in Ukraine. It was just a refurbishment of this freedom agenda talk that, if it had been coming out of George W. Bush's mouth at this point, would have been roundly ridiculed. But Biden gets away with it because everybody thinks that, the rules-based international order needs to be defended by, sending a limitless supply of Javelin missiles or something into the Donbass.
Okay,
there's a bit of a difference between advocating for democracy in a semi-Western country that wants to join the EU and carpet bombing democracy over Iraq. So I'm not sure it would be very fair to compare the two and say it's part of the same narrative, really, when in fact, culturally, civilizationally, the contexts are quite different.
Right. Gentlemen, we do need to take a very quick break, but obviously we have so much more to unpack, so don't go anywhere. You're staying with us. Break, and we're back. Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Christopher Neiweem, Michael Tracey, and Nathanael Chouraqui. Thank you, gentlemen, very much for staying with us. We're also staying on topic, of course, but before we get back to our conversation, the war sought to diminish radical forces, but did it merely fuel extremism? Let's take a listen to Paul Bramer, former head of the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq.
I've seen some reports about how this decree threw 400,000 regular Army people out of work. This isn't true. The 400,000 regular Army people were thrown out of work by something called the Freedom of Iraq. The Iraqi Army essentially was dissolved. Either they were killed or they've gone back to their homes before this decree.
So let's get to it. Gentlemen, a boomerang effect of sort. To what extent should the U.S. or is the U.S. To blame for the rise of extremism from Al-Qaeda in Iraq to ISIS? Another quick fire round and we pick it up from there. Nathanael Chouraqui, please take the lead.
Well, I mean, it's well documented that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who was the leader of Islamic State, actually emerged from Camp Bucca, which was a prison camp for Iraqis, in which he entered a secular, and he was radicalized there quite clearly. That has nothing to do with any intention, of course, from the US party to radicalize him, but this is what happened. It's also to do with the way the US has navigated the Sunni-Shia divide on which ISIS has thrived.
Christopher Neiweem, your take.
I actually served at Camp Bucca, but this was previous to that. This was 2003 when the war first started. But, well, for one, I think looking back, the troop levels, having 40 to 130,000 troops with a rolling head start was able to knock Saddam Hussein out. Unfortunately, I think we would have needed several 100,000 troops to completely control and occupy the country and quell those types of uprisings early. And I agree with my colleague that unfortunately those fires, those consternations that were never after Sykes-Picot gave way to those issues. So it was a failure. I mean, there's no excuse at this point. I think looking back 20 years to defend the conflict, especially when many of those that voted for it never served in the military and never went to war themselves.
Michael Tracey, last but not least.
Well, I mean, it goes without saying that the war unleashed a wave of fanaticism, both religious and secular, that continues to stew in some form or another. And I hate to bring it back to present day debates, but it does seem as though lots of these facts are fairly well worn at this point. And so I do think the more fruitful discussion on the event of this particular anniversary is to take a bit more of a subtle view as to the lingering legacies of the Iraq War that maybe are a bit more subtle, but still kind of shape how American foreign policy gets crafted. You
know what? Let's ditch the hindsight, gentlemen, and let's take another listen. It is a segment from dating back to February 2007 from former Malaysian Prime Minister Dr. Muhammad. Let's take a listen to what he had to say and connect it to nowadays.
Prime Minister Blair regretted the hanging of Saddam Hussein, but at the same time reminded people not to forget that Saddam was the butcher of Baghdad. What is Blair if not the co-murderer of 500,000 Iraqi children? What Blair and Bush had done is worse than what Saddam had done. We should not hang Blair if the tribunal finds him guilty, but he should always carry the label war criminal, killer of children, liar.
So, Michael, should George W. Bush and Tony Blair be tried for war crimes, as the Malaysian former Prime Minister suggested?
It's a moot point because they won't, because international criminal law, such as it exists, as we've seen just in the past few days with this issuance of an arrest warrant by the International Criminal Court, it's an instrument of the global hegemonic powers to exert their will, frankly. And the merits of this or that law and the applicability of a certain criminal prohibition per the Rome Statute to a particular offense in a particular war theater is not really that relevant. It's relevant only insofar as the interests of the critical mass of the world's powers align with the International Criminal Court to basically do their will. And so the United States is never going to countenance any sort of criminal action against its former president. Neither would it countenance the same with the UK. But now that, the U.S. policy apparatus is essentially geared toward regime change in Russia as the aspiration that they're driving toward ultimately, that comes a point when International Criminal Court arrest warrant, such as was issued a few days ago, all of a sudden becomes perfectly applicable and prudent.
So speaking about the doctrine of regime change, Christopher, could there be another Western Iraq war, so to speak?
I mean, it's certainly possible. Here's the other challenge, too, that we have to glance back at is it's easy to be wholly critical, especially when you never participate in these things. You're sort of on the bench, many journalists are. But here's the other thing. There's no comments about Saddam Hussein or his children going into weddings and raping women and murdering people. And all that stuff was going on before the invasion. So, no one talks about all the global aid the U.S. gives or what President Bush did in Africa. They're solely going to focus on the Iraq war. And I think you can criticize it on the merits, and that's wholly justified. But it gets easy to get into this sort of winding staircase of constantly critiquing, even though you don't have any solution of your own. You don't have any specific foreign policy plans in the world other than to criticize what's going on at that moment in time. So it was a missed opportunity. It was I have to admit, it was a failure looking 20 years back, but there's also opportunities along the way that at some point the people in that region need to seize. I think disbanding the Iraqi army was another point we missed here. That was a mistake retrospectively, but we tried, we failed, and I could say, at least from the military's perspective, a lot of people put a lot of effort in trying to make it a better place. And I think it'd be nice if people would kind of look at a full picture once in a while instead of just a narrow perspective of folks who never were there, were on the bench their whole life.
So, Nathaniel, we're both listening to Christopher making a very valid point about whether the mere debate, in hindsight, just, unjust, is it moral, is it conducive, either, neither?
I mean, let's set aside the fact that indeed there were a number of well-intentioned and in fact very genuine people who did want from the onset or as the war was unfolding to make Iraq a better place. The question is not there. The question is whether it was justified as a foreign policy objective at all to impose on a sovereign country a new regime and to even think that democracy could come from the top and not from the bottom, and what kind of ideological hubris, to quote my fellow panelist, led to this, whether this ideological hubris is still with us today, and that circles back to your previous question, is I think not. I think we couldn't see another war of regime change nowadays. After the trauma of Iraq, after the delusion of the idea of spreading democracy at all, not exclusively by force, but at all, the insecurity it has distillated, for better or worse, in the Western certainty of the superiority of their own model. I don't think this could happen. You had like some talks of regime change under Bolton regarding Iran, but never through violent intervention means, and it wasn't very much followed by any effective foreign policy other than sanctions. So it was the death of something that probably should have died, that clearly did not survive the Iraq war.
Christopher, really, in the 20
With all due respect to your guest who served in Iraq, and I appreciate that gives him a unique perspective. I wouldn't presume to be able to have the same perspective that he has on that whole experience. But the idea that 20 years later, that your critique of the Iraq war policy could still boil down to that the occupation force wasn't large enough or that the Iraqi military was disbanded, I mean, that's been conventional wisdom among hawks for 20 years. And frankly, those same talking points could be repeated now gets to why, yes, regime change could still very well be and is an object of U.S. foreign policy, because people still allow themselves to get bogged down in these trivial sort of quibbling debates.
Gentlemen, unfortunately, we have to say thank you and goodbye.